The rising inequality and growing political instability that we see today are the direct result of decades of bad economic theory.
The last 5 decades of trickle-down economics haven't worked. But what's the alternative?
Middle-out economics is the answer.
Because the middle class is the source of growth, not its consequence.
That's right.
This is Pitchfork Economics with Nick Hanauer, a podcast about how to build the economy from the middle out. Welcome to the show.
We've made a lot of heretical assertions about economics over the years, Nick. And today, I just want to start this conversation by making the most heretical assertion of all. And I'm embarrassed and ashamed to say this, but I have to say that there's one thing good that has come out of the Trump administration, and that is that he has forced a conversation on trade. For better or worse, his policies are nuts, completely insane, but they are at least as, his take is at least as heretical as ours. And it's forced people to rethink and re-examine what has been the consensus for not just the past 40 years, but really the consensus for the past 150 years in economics on trade. And that is what we're going to be talking about over the next few episodes. And it's really fitting because as much as neither one of us are economists, we're not natural experts in this field. You, Nick, have actual business experience in the field of international trade.
Yeah, it's true. One of the things that's, before we jump in, it's one of the things that's, I think, interesting and relevant is the definition, right? Because humans have been trading for as long as there have been humans.
It's what we do. We truck and barter, I think exactly. Is the economic term. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and by way of anecdote, in our place in the San Juan Islands, because we dug some holes doing some repair work, we had to have some archaeologists on site looking at stuff. And we found materials on Orcas Island, Washington, which is a pretty remote place in the very northwest corner of the United States. We found materials that had been imported by those folks from Central Oregon, obsidian, that's dated back 2,500 years, right? That's nothing compared to how far back trade goes. The other thing I think that's worth noting is that until people really started to create borders, there was no such thing as international trade, right?
So let's start definitionally. You and I, we are pro-trade because we're pro-human. And it gets back to the very foundation when we talk about economics, where prosperity comes from, where innovation comes from. Trade, well, it's not the first thing. The first thing is we make stuff, right?
Yeah, right.
And a lone human out in the wilderness, which, by the way, is something that doesn't exist. That's not how we evolved.
Right.
We evolved in social groups. But if all you're doing is providing for your subsistence needs, you've got nothing to trade. Right, but you have a very meager existence. You right. So
well, yes and no. I mean, the indigenous populations in the San Juan Islands were merely trying to provide for themselves. But obsidian, which is a very important tool, but
they didn't have that tool, so they had to trade for it.
To trade for it,
right? So,
exactly.
So what it comes down to this are really. We talk about prosperity coming from the division of knowledge and know-how across vast networks of highly cooperative specialists, but without trade, you can't specialize.
Yeah.
Because if you specialize in mining obsidian, then you need somebody else to grow food for you.
Correct.
Right? If you specialize in making iPhones, you need somebody else to grow food for you, build houses, whatever it is, provide health care. And so when we talk about trade at a very fundamental level, it is exchange. It is the voluntary exchange of goods and services. You pay me, Nick, and in exchange for that, I don't give you as much as you probably expect. As I like to joke, you don't actually pay me for my labor. You purchase my intellectual property.
Yeah.
That's what the economy is. It's people
Yeah.
exchanging goods and services, and that allows us to specialize into an infinite variety of things which enrich us all. But
Yeah.
that's not what we're talking about.
No, we're going to talk about international trade.
International trade, which requires nations, and the nation state is a relatively recent phenomenon in history. There were markets well before there were nation states.
That's
And
right.
so we're really talking about the past couple hundred years after the mercantilist period, after Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the modern nation state.
And trade impacts significantly how competitive each of those nation states is with respect to the other ones, which is why it's so relevant. In any case, all of this brings back memories from my days of actually doing trade. And if you don't mind, let me just share an anecdote from the past, which I think is...
Let's table set. You came from a family business,
that's right,
pillow
a manufacturer of home furnishings.
Right.
Bed pillows, down comforters, mattress pads, those sorts of things.
Nick is the progressive My Pillow guy.
Yeah, exactly. and it was a pretty big company, and we had a bunch of factories around the country. I don't know, half a dozen factories around the United States, but we relied heavily on foreign imports for the raw materials. In particular, duck and goose down, which you basically really can't buy in the United States because nobody eats really very many ducks and geese. And in Asia, they eat bazillions of them. And down is a waste byproduct of the poultry industry.
Right. And to be clear, chicken feathers, not the same thing.
Not the same thing. Can't use those. So anyway, many, many, many years ago, when I think I was in my mid or late 20s, the United States government, in their wisdom, enacted a new set of trade policies and adjusted the duty rates in a way that made importing the raw materials from China had twice the duty rate of importing the finished products.
I can't imagine what might come from that.
Exactly. It was titanically stupid. But, let's be clear, my industry is a relatively small industry, and I'm sure the people at the Customs Service and Congress who cooked this up didn't think it through at that level of detail. But it created a crisis for my business, my company, because we manufactured all of our products in the United States. We didn't import finished goods. We were faced with the prospect of having to shut our factories down and just start importing, and that's not something that we really wanted to do. And I guess at the end of the day, it would have been the same for me. Actually, maybe we'd have made more money, right? Because we could have gotten rid of all those manufacturing workers, but it just didn't seem right. And so I took it upon myself to try to reverse this, and I hired a lawyer in Washington, D.C., who was expert in trade and flew out there, and he and I tried to fix this. And it was an incredibly... how should I put it? It was an incredible learning experience for me. And most definitely a really big affirmation for me of the positives of how the federal government works. Because, I went around from congressional office to congressional office trying to enlist support. And I simply explained the situation. And without fail, every congressional office I talked to was sympathetic and helpful. And they all put their shoulder to the wheel to try to get the Customs Service to do something about this. And by the way, Congress doesn't set the actual duty rates. They pass a bill that instructs the Customs Service to interpret, so it's all sort of a matter of interpretation of Congress's intent. At least that's the way it used to work. Today, it's like you literally have the president just says 31%, which is completely nuts.
Well, thank God he's finally sticking it to the Swiss.
Exactly, those bastards. To make a long story short, all of that effort culminated in a meeting I got to have with the Commissioner of Customs, and we explained the situation to him, and they changed it. Like they were like, this is crazy. We didn't mean to do this. We're going to fix it. And they did.
And I'm sure had a couple of your workers gone to DC and tried to do the same thing on their own without the owner of the company with them, they would have had the same success.
I think that's right.
You think so?
Oh, absolutely. I do think that's right. No. I absolutely think that's right. I mean,
You
obviously,
think they would have had the means to hire
no, no. I mean,
a
but
trade attorney and make all these meetings? I'm just saying that
no,
you were able to do it from a position of relative power and wealth.
yes, but I think that misses the point, Goldie. I didn't give $1 away of campaign donations. I mean, it would have for sure been harder for a worker to do that, but it would have probably made my job twice as easy if I thought to bring some of the workers
Right.
in those meetings.
But
right?
you know, it would have made your job even easier, Nick?
What?
Deciding not to do this and just offshoring the jobs to
Correct.
China.
Correct.
And you probably would have made more money that
I would have
way.
made more money.
And that
Yeah.
is the decision that most capitalists make. And that's
Yeah.
why, you know,
Yeah.
they didn't fight these things. It was, oh, great, it's cheaper to
Yeah.
import pillows and comforters now. Let's do that.
Yeah. But anyway, I think there's more to the story because what we realized through this process was that our Chinese competitors were being given significant rebates from their government for exporting finished products. So at that time, as I recall, for every finished product that our competitors in China exported, they would get approximately a 10% rebate from the government for doing that. To say nothing of the subsidized cotton prices and you know, a variety of other things. And so for the longest time, I've had a very suspicious view of Chinese trade practices.
Right. Those damn Chinese for using the same sort of industrial policies that every other industrialized nation used to build their economy.
Yeah, but for sure, yeah, but they use it ruthlessly and very, very effectively, and it's simply not true. I mean, certainly that there have been moments or industries that benefited from trade policy, but the garment industry in the United States never benefited from trade policy, and the toy business never benefited from trade policy, and the home furnishings business never benefited from trade policy, and I could name 100 other businesses that never benefited from any sort of
manufacturing,
just generally.
industries. They didn't benefit in the past 50 years, you know, benefited 150 years ago.
Maybe. Yeah. I don't know. But and should all of those industries still be in the United States? It's not clear. But the great orange man is not completely wrong that we have let certainly China take advantage of us. And I'll tell you another thing that I learned, and this was probably at the height of this policy agenda, is that the USTR, the United States Trade Representative, trade is, you know, theoretically, I think, part of commerce. But the truth is, and people were explicit about it back then, is this was effectively an operating arm of the foreign policy apparatus of the United States. That the country used trade as a foreign policy lever. And, you know, the prevailing idea was that the more we traded with people, the closer we would be, that we would turn enemies into allies through trade.
And communist countries into capitalist
That's
democracies.
Right. Absolutely. That was the whole rationale.
That we were
behind
promised
it.
that opening up to China and
Yeah.
developing China.
Right. It was all going to be great for everybody.
Yeah.
Obviously, that did not work out, but it does illuminate the complexities of all of this and why some of it happened. Right? Is that it wasn't just this naive view of comparative advantage, or that, you know, that sort of orthodox view that all trade is good and the more you have, the better off everyone will be. I think what animated a lot of the trade policy of the United States in the 80s, 90s, 2000s was this well-meaning but ultimately naive view that by giving the world access to our markets, we'd all be one big happy family.
Yeah, we'd create a more prosperous and peaceful world. And
peaceful world.
Much cheaper to, you know, maybe ship some jobs overseas to China than it is to fight a war with them.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right,
Absolutely.
Instead, we're going to end up fighting a war with a very industrialized,
exactly.
prosperous China
Exactly.
eventually. But that was the theory.
Yeah.
And so you make a point that a lot of this policy wasn't justified internally by pure comparative advantage, which
Yeah.
we will get to in
Yeah.
these episodes, defining what we mean by that. It's that classic thing you might have been taught in high school or college about how trade always advantages both partners.
Yeah.
But it was publicly justified by orthodox theory.
Yeah.
I
That's true.
remember NAFTA, first the first Bush administration, and then when Clinton won, very famously, Al Gore was the spokesperson for getting NAFTA passed through Congress. This was a bipartisan effort. It was negotiated in the Bush administration and passed under the Clinton administration. And a lot of the arguments they were making publicly were those economic justifications
Yes.
of why this is good for everybody, how many new jobs would be created in the US through these liberalized. And NAFTA was just Canada and Mexico. But, there were plenty of other trade agreements
Yeah.
going on around the same time. The intellectual framework through which this, whether you want to call it trade policy or foreign policy, was enacted and implemented, that intellectual framework was the orthodox framework that trade is always a net good
Absolutely.
for reasons that we will go into more detail in future episodes. I want to get back to why this is really important and why we're going to spend so much time talking about this issue. There's a fundamental disagreement between orthodox economics and the way a real economy works.
Yeah.
And trade, as we said, is essential because without trade, there can be no specialization. We can't specialize if we
Yeah.
can't trade the specialized products and services that we produce. But it also gets
And if I could just interrupt, it certainly has historically been true,
right.
and is still true to a certain extent, is that forget products, there are materials like obsidian, to use the former example, that may not be available to you in your
Right.
area that you need for some kind of critical component of a product that you need to make, right? And
Right.
that in the beginning, that's why people traded, right? Is
And forget about needs just once. There are
Yeah.
things that
yeah. If you want gold,
if you're into French wine, you can only get it from France. I
That's right.
love good olive oil. There's some
Yeah.
good California olive oil, but we can't produce enough olive oil in the U.S. to meet our demand. There's lots of things that we import simply because we like them and it improves our lives because it
Yeah.
makes us happier.
right?
But I want to get to a really fundamental, different way of understanding the economy, which is the orthodox economists view all this in terms of GDP. You just count up all the goods and services and
Right.
that are exchanged and the prices on them, and that's the economy, right? That's how, if it grows, that's good. If it shrinks, that's bad. If it's flat, oh no, people are unhappy. We look at it very differently in terms of prosperity coming out of increasing complexity.
Correct.
That very simply, we view the economy as something that solves human problems,
Yes.
right? We make goods and services. I like a good olive oil. You give me a good olive oil, you've solved my problem. In the same way, let's say an mRNA vaccine, which soon won't be available here, solves the problem
Yeah.
of prevents you from getting COVID. Right. However complex you want to be, the iPhone, the earbuds that you're listening to this podcast on now, those are all solutions to human problems. As we solve problems, we create problems. And what you see is really you can measure prosperity and the prosperity of an economy by the amount of complexity within it. Because we imbue value into goods and services through that specialization we talked about, all that specialized knowledge and know-how networked across vast differences and hundreds or thousands or millions of people. And also over decades, centuries of accumulating knowledge and know-how. And you can look at the complexity of an economy and get a pretty good idea of how prosperous and resilient it is. And importantly, because technologies and industries evolved into adjacent product space,
Yes.
it's path dependent. The
Yeah.
more complex your economy, the more complex it can be. If you don't have a textile industry in place, it's very hard to expand into
Kevlar.
right. right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great
Right.
example.
Yes.
If you don't have a steel industry, it's hard to expand into specialty metals, specialty steel, because you don't
Yeah.
have.
Right.
And this is historically, and this is why China did the things it did, why it was
Yes.
so focused on building a textile industry, because historically, textiles has been the stepping stone into more complex manufacturing processes. It
Yes.
was in the UK, it was in the US, it was just about everywhere. That's why developing countries focus on textiles. And then you expand into
Yeah.
adjacent product space from there. So
Right.
when we offshore an entire industry,
Yes.
we're not just eliminating jobs in the present, we're eliminating the possibility of jobs in the future, because that path to those jobs either no longer exists or is very difficult to recreate. Because, as the physicist Cesar Hidalgo points out, knowledge is heavy.
Yeah.
It's actually much harder to import knowledge and know-how because it's embodied in human beings. You have to,
Yes.
and in that ability for them to cooperate.
Yeah.
So when we simplify our economy, which is what comparative advantage tells you to do,
Yes.
they want you to focus on the things that you are best at
Yeah.
and let other people do the other things. When you simplify your economy, you actually,
There's a big trade-off.
right,
Yeah.
and it comes in the future.
We wanted to provide additional depth on job creation and loss associated with trade. So Pitchfork economics producer Freddie Doss sat down and spoke with MIT professor David Autor.
My name is David Autor. I'm a labor economist at MIT, and I study factors that affect earnings, employment, and opportunity. I focus a lot on both globalization and technological change, most recently AI.
You and your co-authors studied how U.S. labor markets responded to the China trade shock in a paper called Places versus People, the ins and outs of labor market adjustment to globalization. What were you trying to understand, and what makes this study different from other studies and research on trade?
What this study tried to do is ask those questions simultaneously by looking both at a place and the people that were in the place originally. And to say, like, okay, do places recover? And if they do workers recover? Can we make that assumption? Or if workers recover, do places recover? Or is it possible for them to go in different directions? And so we could follow both. By place, we mean the local labor market where manufacturing was housed. And we can say, look, what happened to wages? What happened to the industry composition? Who's working? Who's not working? And then by people, we mean, let's look at the people who were in that labor market in 2000 when the China trade shock hit. Some who were working in manufacturing, some were working in non-manufacturing. Where did they go? Did they stay in the same place? Did they leave the labor force? Did they move from manufacturing to non-manufacturing? Did they retire? And so that's the setup. And the surprise is you get really different answers when you look at the places versus the people. Not incompatible answers, they make sense, but you would reach a different set of conclusions. If you look at the places, you would say, wow, these places they've kind of transformed themselves. Right? There's much less manufacturing. Once manufacturing goes down, it never comes back. On the other hand, there are more jobs relative to other places. After 2010, employment kind of rebounds. These jobs are in a really different set of sectors. A large part of it is healthcare and education. Not like fancy hospitals, but just like care facilities for elderly folks and so on. Healthcare and education. And then you'll find warehousing, trucking, hospitality, and low-paid services. So you're primarily a low-paid economy, except for the healthcare jobs, some of them. And so they're in a different set of industries, and it's really a different set of people working. The places have changed. You wouldn't say they're more affluent, but they are economically active, and there's new things going on. And the people, and there's a whole different set of people, and the people who were originally there, the world has changed around them dramatically, right? They've stayed in place, and everyone else has reshuffled the deck. And so I imagine from their perspective, the world looks like it's changing really rapidly around them, even though they're holding still. Politicians are so busy looking over their shoulder at the war that we lost 20 years ago at the battle, that they are not noticing the kind of troops surging over the mountains for the current battle. And that's really going to be costly in the much longer run, much more costly. Because those old sectors, although they provided decent jobs, and that was great, they were not what gave us military or economic or political leadership. They didn't give us the kind of innovation that is so critical to an affluent country to keep moving ahead. They were not the source of dynamism in many ways, I mean, they're great jobs. I don't mean them any, casting aspersions on. I'm sorry to lose them, but they weren't really where the future was. Many of these were jobs of a century ago that had been migrating to lower and lower wage places and would eventually migrate overseas. These sectors, that I just mentioned, semiconductors and robotics and EVs and aviation and drones and fusion power and so many things, those are where the future is. And they're going to create the profits and they're going to create the jobs and bring the talent. And those are really threatened. And so our current trade policies actually deeply threaten to undermine those because they just make everything expensive to do here. There are things that are worth paying for, right? I do not think just lower consumer prices is the measure of a national or individual well-being, right? Obviously, no matter how low the prices are, if you don't have a good job, it's not really much help to you. We should be willing to invest, absolutely. And even if that's costly, even if that hurts, but we got to make the right investments. And right now I fear we are trying to relive and change the past rather than the present and future that is so imminent, so immediate right now.
I want to talk just for a second about knowledge and know-how because the distinction is so important.
Mm-hmm.
So knowledge is what is contained in a book, right? So for example, you can have a book which tells you everything about how to play the guitar.
Mm-hmm.
But playing the guitar takes a lot more than reading a book.
Right.
Right. People who can play the guitar have know-how in addition to knowledge.
And they don't generally learn it by reading a book.
Yes, correct.
Right.
And so, like, you can read a book on how to make super complex transistors, but being able to do it is completely different.
Well, I'll give you a more prosaic example. I had my gallbladder removed last year, and you can certainly read a book on how to remove your own gallbladder.
Yeah,
but I did not go to a guy who read a book. I
Yeah.
went to a trained surgeon with many years
Of practice, right.
of practice doing it. And that's who removed my gallbladder.
That's right. And this is such an important point, right? Is that the devil's in the details, right? Having a workforce that has the know-how to do a particular thing, which is adjacent to a new thing that you want to do, is absolutely critical for being able to do that new thing. And if you don't have that knowledge and know-how available, spinning it up from scratch is virtually impossible. It's just incredibly hard. And again, if your goal is prosperity in the future, then the embedded knowledge and know-how that you presently have in your economy is the best indicator of what will happen in the future. Because if you don't have much, you're not, unless there's some lucky windfall, you strike oil or something like that, the chances are not great that your trajectory will be good.
Well, actually, if you strike oil, your chances are worse.
Yeah, probably over time. Yeah,
over time.
But anyway,
right, because
but this
you
is
end up specializing in extracting oil from the ground, which
well, I mean, it'll prop up your GDP.
Right, but Venezuela had a lot of oil.
That's
still
true.
Does.
Yeah, that perspective is something that I think the Germans have understood for a very long time, right? That the Germans have been phenomenal at protecting their industries in a way that enables them to continually be at the forefront of making whatever is important in the future. And so I think that the United States is relearning some of these lessons, albeit in the most stupid and counterproductive way right now. Certainly, the Biden administration understood this in a small way because the biggest focus of the economic programs were CHIPS and the IRA, all aimed at bringing these industries of the future back to the United States, which the Trump administration is doing their best to reverse.
I think they understood it in a bigger way than they were able to enact on it, because when you remember the words of the U.S. Trade Representative, talking about how we need to build a more resilient economy, and that has a lot to do with complexity too. The more complex your economy, it can be fragile, but it can also be resilient, because as the economy evolves, you have a lot more mimetic diversity within that economy. that allows you to adapt.
Certainly the pandemic brought that to the fore for a lot of people, because all of a sudden, as the global supply chains broke, people discovered that the United States was incapable of making the simplest things, like face masks, right? Like you could,
Right.
there was nobody in the country who could make a face mask, which is just insane.
The important takeaway here is just because Trump is wrong on trade doesn't mean the orthodox
Correct.
view was right. They're both wrong in different ways. It's a lot more nuanced, a lot more complicated. Trade is good. Not
Correct.
all trade is good.
Yes, exactly. And not on
Oh my gosh.
and not any terms. And and the other thing,
Right.
Goldy, that my experience doing trade taught me is that our trade policies allow us to export a lot of externalities too. So for example, we bought most of our fabrics in China too, and they were much cheaper, but it wasn't just because labor was lower in China. It was also because the Chinese dyeing factories and weaving factories dumped their effluent directly into the rivers. Things are different now, but when I was going to China in the 80s and 90s, it was so horrifically polluted. It staggered the imagination. I mean, the whole country was a cesspool. And those things also need to be taken into account, right? Bad practices by other countries bring prices down, and often those bad practices will catch up with us somehow, some way too. A lot of trade policy hides really terrible behavior, right? To say nothing of child labor and all that kind of very obvious stuff, but there's a whole layer of less obvious stuff that goes on that is equally horrible.
This, Nick, gets to a basic critique of comparative advantage. What is comparative advantage and what isn't? And it's not simply your ability to produce something cheaper. Because there's lots of reasons why you can produce something cheaper. You could have very low or zero environmental regulations. You could have forced labor or very low exploitive labor costs. And so a lot of what's happened with these jobs going overseas is less comparative advantage than it is wage arbitrage.
Wage and pollution arbitrage.
Right. That's not a comparative advantage. That might be a competitive advantage, but it's not a comparative advantage that you are. Now, let's be clear. China is today more efficient at producing a lot of things than we are, because they've had 20 years to refine their processes. But at first, they were just cheaper. And, I don't know if you remember, when we were kids, you would get products sometimes that said made in Japan. And if it was said, I actually have something which says made in occupied Japan. It's a treasure. When we were kids, made in Japan was a sign of cheapness. You didn't want something made in Japan because it was a load of crap. It was a piece of crap that wasn't going to last. And then by the 80s, made in Japan was, that's quality. That's the high quality stuff is made in Japan. And at first, it was a competitive advantage because, their economy had been destroyed and, labor was cheap and so forth. But eventually they built these efficiencies over several decades, and their stuff became high quality. And so we preferred the Japanese stuff, and that's true of a lot of Chinese imports as well. Those iPhones are very high quality, designed in the U.S., manufactured in China. So I want to use this to talk a little bit to get into a conversation about labor, which is something we haven't talked a lot so far on this episode. And this will be key to, and we'll talk about this in later episodes on trade, but just to sum it up right now, this idea, we were told by everybody, Republicans and Democrats alike, in the 90s when we really opened up all this would be good for everybody. Yeah, there'd be winners and losers, but we'd retrain the losers and we'd create a lot of great jobs and so forth. But in fact, we ended up impoverishing not just millions of people, but huge swaths of the country were deindustrialized in the 80s and 90s and aughts over the past 40 years due to our trade policies. the idea that in some ways, in many ways, our trade policy has been class warfare.
Yeah.
That your class has won. And yes, you did not want to
Yeah.
close your factories and move them overseas, but your family did eventually sell the family business. Do they have any U.S. factories?
They bankrupted it within a year. Private equity.
But I'm sure they made money.
Yeah.
Private equity made money.
Who are those criminals? I think it was called Sentinel. Just completely incompetent buffoons.
Right. And the people who really suffered were the workers
course.
who
Yeah.
lost their jobs in the end,
Yeah.
not the private
Yes.
equity people.
They
I'm
were
sure they
fine.
figured out how to pay themselves. That's
They
right.
fucked everybody else.
Right.
Like they always do.
They fucked everybody else. And that is class warfare.
For a deeper look into the roots of cooperative trade, Pitchfork economics producer Freddie Doss turned to historian and author Mark Palin.
Mark Palin. I'm a historian at the University of Exeter in Southwest England. I teach about the history of empires and anti-imperialism and peace and globalization and all the ways that those are connected. And it's really kind of those connections that I also explore in Pax Economica, my new book. The left-wing internationalists, the progressives, the left-wing globalists of their age, they tend to say, well, how can we create something different? Something that doesn't support monopolies, that doesn't support high prices and doesn't create trade wars, doesn't create this geopolitical conflict, that doesn't lead to a search for new markets. Can we do something different? And so for a lot of them, then they saw this free trade system that could be implemented instead. This interdependence theory, if you want to call it, capitalist peace theory, as some in international relations scholarship call this, right? The idea that the more you trade with one another, the less likely they are to go to war. Why would you want to go to war with your trading partners? This sort of thing. One of the things the left-wing free traders, especially from the early 20th century, wanted was supranational regulation of. They saw no contradiction calling for the supranational regulation of foodstuffs, because there was enough food to feed the world, right? If you had true global trade in a way that was equitable and not just about profit seeking. So I think you lost that kind of non-profit motive that I think in many ways drove at least parts of the left-wing free trade movement. That still exists, I think, in the international cooperative movement. If anybody shops at a co-op, you're kind of walking into this left-wing free trade legacy there. There could have been a free trade world order, as they saw it at least, where labor and environmental protections could still be a really big part of that. You could have social and economic justice high on the menu. Democratization could be a key part of this too. And peace and an end of empires is just kind of a natural byproduct of that vision.
I do like the idea that if you go to a food co-op today, that's like a remnant of what their kind of idea was, but on a much smaller scale.
When we look at where we are right now, economically and politically, obviously you and I, we've been working together for more than a decade now on inequality issues. Again, we started off by talking about Trump. Trump doesn't exist without 40 years of class warfare. I'm not saying that Trump is a champion of working people like he says he is. He isn't. But It's understandable because nobody else has been representing the interests of working people. So maybe this autocrat will do it for them. And so the undermining of our democracy has come from the undermining of the American dream, of that promise, which was always kind of a myth, but was still that promise that the country, the economy would work for everybody and every generation would do better than the last, and we'd see constantly rising living standards, which we have not seen for the majority of American. And a lot of that has been because of the way we have deindustrialized. Right. And this gets to another point which we've talked about, which is this idea that industrial jobs are the best jobs. You hear this from Trump. He wants to bring these good industrial jobs back home. Who was it? Which secretary of his talked about his beautiful vision of millions of Americans screwing tiny screws into phones? Was that whichever? I don't know if it was Commerce or Treasury, whatever. That's just insane. There's a reason why manufacturing jobs were good jobs, and that is because they were unionized. They were crappy jobs.
Yeah, they were the worst jobs ever.
They were horrible jobs, the worst jobs, the satanic mills, right? There's a reason why they were terrible jobs until the labor movement, they were unionized, and then they became middle-class jobs. You didn't have auto workers buying cabins in the woods and boats and RVs and going on vacations before the 1950s. This was something that happened in the 30s and the 40s and the 50s and continued into the 60s and into the 70s, which we have since destroyed, the labor movement. So there's no particular reason why service jobs can't be good jobs too. Good jobs in the sense that they pay well and come with great benefits. Why those jobs can't be middle class jobs too. We have just sort of made the manufacturing job iconic because it's something we had for 30 years, that where you could go to work in the factory and retire 30 years later with a good pension and middle class home and send your kids to college. You could afford to send your kids to college. And that's the irony. Why did you want to send your kids to college? So they wouldn't have to work in the goddamn factory.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. No. It's so true. It's so true. So, Goldy, why are we blabbing on and on and on, just you and me, about trade?
Well, again, as I started at the top, because to some extent, Trump has made it an issue. And to be clear, it's something you and I have been thinking about for many years. Yet we've had a very difficult time talking about it because there's a lot of...
Yeah, it's much more complicated than many other economic issues.
It's difficult to pack into a middle-out narrative for a lot of reasons. And we've put a lot of thought into it. And I think now that the nation is focused on trade, we felt like we had an obligation to
do a series on trade.
Right, to dive into it publicly and not just share our thoughts, but also kind of work it out. Because I think with some of the guests we have on in the upcoming episodes, you don't agree with all of them. And you and I don't agree with each other on some of this. We'll talk to the authors of the book Trade Wars or Class Wars. And you're a little more skeptical of their thesis than I am. I think it is about, and there's a class war, and understand part of the class war with China is going on in China.
I mean, just to be clear, Goldy, all wars are class wars.
In a sense. I mean, the people starting them and the people fighting them tend to be of different classes. Yes. So we're talking about this because it is the talk of the nation right now, and it's absolutely essential to understanding how economies work, market economies, all economies. And it would be negligent of us to ignore this topic, especially at this moment in time. In the coming episodes, we're going to be talking about, we're going to get step through this. We're going to talk about the history of not just trade, but of ideas about trade, both on the left and the right, and the history of globalization, what its impact has been on the real lives of workers, of American workers, and also on our democratic institutions, which, spoiler alert, it's not been good.
It's not been good.
As is typical, we're not just going to talk with economists, because quite frankly, the number of economists who are willing to think deeply and creatively about these issues is, there's a lot of them out there, but as a percentage of the field, it's relatively small. Comparative advantage, that is canon. If you say you don't believe in comparative advantage, you're crazy. So we'll be hearing from historians, labor leaders, policy thinkers about what trade is and how we might reimagine our policies. We're going to talk a little bit about protectionism, which is really what Trump is kind of sort of talking about, though. I think if you give him a gold bar or an airplane, he's willing to drop your tariffs. So I'm not sure who he's trying to protect. But, again, look, talk and action are two different things. And we want to take advantage of the fact that at least he's getting people to talk about this stuff to maybe get people to more creatively rethink it. I think the hardest part for us is when we get to the benevolent dictator question. We don't use that term anymore. What do we call it now?
I can't remember.
The magic wand. We call it the magic wand because it was easy to talk about a benevolent dictator when we didn't have a dictator. Let's just put it that way. So, exactly, it's hard for even us, you and me, to come up with creative trade policies because we're path dependent, right? We're so constrained by our own experiences and our own decades of being constrained by orthodox thinking on this. It's one thing to understand that the orthodox thinking is wrong. It's another thing to be able to come up with some novel and innovative approach. And so what ends up happening, and this is true a lot with the policies we talk about in many areas, is we end up with policy ideas that seem old.
Yes.
Or familiar, like industrial policy.
Yes.
Which is a terrible phrase, but whatever. The type of stuff that Biden had started doing. We come to these things, but we come to them for different reasons.
Yes.
Than the old New Deal progressives might have. There's a different justification, and so they will end up looking familiar, but being a little different.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
And I think the most important takeaway I hope we get from this series, Nick, is that if we want to build an economy from the middle out, if we want to build a more broadly prosperous, inclusive, democratic, and environmentally sustainable future, our side of this debate, whoever you consider, the non-Trumpers, are going to have to reclaim trade policy as a talking point and as an essential feature of our narrative and our agenda. Because without that, we're just going to get more of the same.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. Well, hopefully it will be an interesting series.
The journey is the reward. In podcasting, I guess, because it's nothing but journey.
Love it.
Pitchfork Economics is produced by Civic Ventures. If you like the show, make sure to follow, rate, and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Find us on other platforms like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and Threads at Pitchfork Economics. Nick's on Twitter and Facebook as well, at Nick Hanauer. For more content from us, you can subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Pitch, over on Substack. And for links to everything we just mentioned, plus transcripts and more, visit our website, pitchforkeconomics.com. As always, from our team at Civic Ventures, thanks for listening. See you next week.